Hello and welcome. Hey, I'm Brian Sohn. I'm in the education department, if you don't know me. I got some education department people here today. Thank you. Today's topic is going to be trauma-informed teaching with the goal of helping students build resilience. And I've been reading and learning about this for 2 years or so, kind of like drinking from a fire hose on this topic. So it's really hard for me to narrow things down, but I've been tinkering with this. I finished this presentation about a month ago, and I've been working on it a little bit almost every day since, because I keep changing my mind. But here we go. This is not a TED Talk. Sorry. But, on the bright side, here we are sitting with each other with a bunch of people who already know a lot of stuff about teaching. And so we're going to call on that resource as we go through this presentation. Okay, not that anybody needs any advice, but just in case, I have some tips on how to do this lunch and learn. You have the secret ingredient to the recipe of success for this lunch and learn, but so is everyone else at your table. So keep that in mind. Encourage everyone to share when I encourage you all to share. Ask questions, be curious, and check for alternative views. It's sometimes easy to come to a consensus, but we know that conflict produces a lot of learning. So ask for alternative views if you find a consensus. So this is a popular Bible verse that I see at the end of some of my friends' emails, and I was like, oh, this is good. All right, I'm going to take some answers to this question. If we keep in mind the verse from Micah, what are ways that we can act justly as teachers? I'm going to repeat your answers so that they are recorded for all posterity. A clear syllabus. That is like a contract. Yeah. Did you read my slides? No. All right. What else? Understand that we're teaching students and not subjects. That is to say, place the person at the forefront of what we're doing rather than the curriculum. Did I interpret that correctly? Yeah, thank you. Okay, flunk them all. That is justice. Okay. All right, great. Well, I have kind of the only partially facetious answer to this. Well, trauma-informed teaching, of course, that's how we do it. And that's what we're going to talk about. So right now, what I'd like you guys to do for a minute or two is just real briefly go around your tables and talk about a time that you noticed resilience. And since we're focused on students, ideally it'll be a story of a student. And as deep as you could go, keep in mind that we have 4 or 5 or 6 people at your table. So go ahead. So here's a common definition that a lot of people are citing in resilience literature. And it's what you might call a classically academic definition, a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. But what I always like to do with all my work is these academic things are useful in that we line out definitions for a reason. They're tools to help us. But we want to bring it to our experience. And this idea that this is a dynamic process may sound generic and academic, but it can be helpful to think about. When we talk about significant adversity, we get to kind of rule out some things. Like, so for example, my daughter who constantly bumps her head against doorknobs as she's sprinting through the house, because that's how tall she is. I don't really call her resilient, right? I say she's tough, right? So we can draw some lines. And though these things exist on a spectrum, we do know that there's quite a significant difference between a student who's stressed out and someone who has gone through a crisis and is recovering. And here's a definition of trauma-informed teaching that I kind of modified from something among, the readings that I've been doing. One of the things we know about resilience is the significant adversity piece. And the significant adversity piece, for the sake of today's presentation, we're going to call it trauma. And again, there's these different levels of trauma. But trauma-informed teaching takes into account the fact that a lot of people have been through trauma. If we all took the most commonly used research instrument, which is adverse childhood experiences, we'd all probably have at least a 1, right? That is, trauma is widespread. We've all had at least one thing. And then we add the pandemic and we get to 2. All right. Trauma is harmful and can be healed through relationship. And this is kind of the basis of trauma-informed teaching, is that last part, that we do have this potential to heal. One thing that's helpful for me is, I'm a teacher, I'm not a counselor, and so I talk to someone in counseling services. I say, hey, I'm going to do this. What advice do you have for me? And Charlie Burchett, who's one of our counselors over there, he gave me this, which is something that's going to be put out to the faculty relatively soon. But our role is not to be the counselor necessarily, and hopefully that makes some of you more comfortable, right? Trauma-informed teaching doesn't mean that you suddenly take on the role of counselor. We have counselors on campus. And what they are advising us, and their training that some of us have been through before with Jennifer Catlett, we've seen the one on the right where we validate, appreciate, and refer. I think the one on the left at least was new to me, that they've put together, and that is, we need to look for signs of stress, distress, or crisis. Stress is a common thing, right? We see that. We see these behaviors. They may be disruptive, but they probably don't need to be referred to counseling for stress, right? As things escalate, we get distress. There can be a significant level of personal struggle, and students may be reluctant or unable, a need for help. And then we have crisis signs, which usually are quite obvious. These are usually preceded by stress and distress, so it's a good thing for us to keep our eyes on. And when the time comes, we can reach out and refer students to counseling. But I want to focus on the teaching part, but we will have a few definitions, and I'm going to use the assistance of a video here. It's only 1.5 minutes, so. Or not. Oh, here we go.
Talk about it or forget about it, we can move on with our lives. Now we understand that trauma is actually a body memory. It gets stored in the central nervous system.
Yeah.
There's been a big shift in recent years in our understanding of how trauma stays with a person over time. We used to think that trauma was held in the brain as a bad memory. We've had the assumption that if we can talk about it or forget about it, we can move on with our lives. Now we understand that trauma is actually a body memory. It gets stored on the central nervous system and stuck in the here and now part of our brain. Any sensations like sight, smell, or sound can bring back memories from a previous event. That means trauma is always running in the background. Here's an example. Beth attends a training session on trauma for work and hears stories and examples of childhood trauma. The next day, Beth breaks out into hives. For the next few days, she's agitated and can't focus. Beth's trauma happened when she was very young and she has no conscious memory of it, but her body kept the score. To figure out what's going on, Beth reaches out to her therapist and friends. With their support, she turns to her adoptive mother for answers and learns she was abandoned by her birth mother as an infant. There are ways to help Beth heal her body that has long had to keep the score. She can do things to tune into her body like meditation, guided breath, dance, prayer, yoga, or singing. And she can notice what her body feels when she is doing these calming activities. This way, she can understand how she might obtain felt safety when she needs it and return to those activities to feel safe over and over again. There is a way to heal from trauma. When we can name our sensations instead of being driven by them, we orient to the here and now, feel the safety in the present moment, and give our body a new score to keep.
Okay, so this video is based on a book called The Body Keeps the Score. The author's last name is Vander Kolk, and it's quite popular. It's a bestseller, and it's one that a lot of people refer to when talking about trauma. Another book that I think is a bestseller as well, if I recall correctly, from 2016, is My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. And his book focuses specifically on healing from racial trauma. And the book is full of thought experiments and things that relate to kind of the last part of that video when it talked about meditation, singing, and prayer. And there are lots of different activities that we can do to work on trauma. But to continue with defining trauma, Resmaa Menakem says that it's an emotion. It's not primarily an emotional response. Trauma happens in the body, and this is something, as educators, as very cognitively focused people, sometimes it's easy for us to kind of think of our shell or whatever as this, the vessel alone as this thing that is incidental, right? But that's not a useful focus necessarily with thinking about trauma. It's a spontaneous protective mechanism to stop or thwart potential damage. At the time, as you see, the baby in that video, at the time formed a particular response to the abandonment. At that time, that response was appropriate and good for survival. And that's what most of the trauma responses are that we see. We just see them later in life in ways that may manifest in ways that are not useful as they were when they first happened. So it's the body's response to an event or series of events that it perceives as potentially dangerous. This gets to what Brenda was saying a minute ago, that for some people, an event can be very harmful and traumatic, and for others, that same kind of thing won't affect them as much. That is, the way things affect us depends on our perception, and that is a big part of whether or not we get a trauma response. These things help me at least think of trauma as something that is to be seen as just kind of a natural reaction that's almost, there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason why one person got traumatized by this kind of event and another did not. And so we see that trauma is not a flaw or a weakness. It's actually like a good response to a situation. Classically, we've all been taught about the fight or flight. With trauma, we also add in freeze, right? With me, that's kind of what I notice, again, on this idea of a spectrum, like if you want to call it trauma, the trauma I grew up with was my sister and my dad yelling at each other constantly, right? So my response when they would fly off the handle at each other was, just be quiet, okay? And I had a situation the other day where that kind of natural reaction that I developed served me pretty well. So I'm in the car line to pick up my kids from school, and this guy stops and he beckons to me to roll down the window, and I love being helpful. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to help. He's got a question. Oh, good. I can help. And he's like, hey, is your kid in school here? And I was like, yeah. Mistake number one. So then that was it. So then he started yelling at me and cussing at me and, you parents are just causing all this. This is how I did it. I had kids. I've been through this. And all I could think of, this is all I could say is, you don't know me. I know you. You're blah, 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 blah. And later I was thinking of like all these funny things I could have said, like, oh, it would have been funny if I would have said this and that and the other thing. Right, but in this case, luckily, my kind of natural reaction to this aggression probably kept me from escalating the situation. Right, so a freeze for me has sometimes been like an appropriate response even later. It's just by chance though. Like my sister's response is to yell and scream and escalate. Right, so she could have gotten in trouble in that same situation. So these are natural responses. These things don't relate to thinking, and so this is something that can help us kind of have empathy for our students when we see that if the body is worried about its safety, it's going to do things that don't relate to rational or logical choices. Okay. So some of the causes of trauma that are classically defined here are abuse, neglect, family violence, disaster, pandemic, war, grief, and other experiences. So these things can happen to individuals, communities, or groups within communities. Again, how people take this depends on the individual, but these are kind of the things that typically cause trauma. And over the last few years, they've expanded beyond those things to include community violence, neighborhood safety, foster care, experience of racism and sexism, bullying, these kinds of things that can all kind of officially, diagnostically count as part of trauma. And if you look at those things, we'd see, oh, so we can accept that trauma is a widespread thing, that these things are happening. Okay. So take a few minutes and talk about some of the signs maybe of trauma that we're seeing in our students. Kind of over the past few years, you've seen more of these signs. That fits in with the national context. Nationally, 37% of participants in the Healthy Minds Network study, which is a college-based survey, 37% reported anxiety, 44% reported depression, and 15% reported suicidal ideation. If you've been following this, you know that since 2008 or so, suicide rates have crept up. There's all these things that are happening that we can see as signs in our students. So there's shutdown and isolation that you've seen personally, and also there's a very recent report that just came out from the Surgeon General focused on isolation. And that's going to be a big focus of the Surgeon General in the next year or so, whatever, that I saw, that's a focus. So what else? As we kind of think about some of the effects we're seeing, and we have different ways of looking at them. We have up here 3 perspectives that are labeled conventional, trauma-informed, and resiliency. Now, of course, as you can tell, the way they've set it up, conventional, they probably set this up in order to be a bad thing, right? Oh, well, you shouldn't think that people are bad. What you should do is think people are resilient. But it's just useful, I think, to compare and think, what are some times when I have seen people as bad, students as bad? What are some times when I have thought instead these students are suffering, and other times and situations perhaps when you've thought my students are resilient? One of the things that I hope you see as we go through the next section is that these second 2 columns go together well, and most of the things that we do in the name of the advice of trauma-informed teaching or trauma-informed practice actually can help students build resilience. So I'm going to jump into the framework, and we're going to kind of answer that previous question as we go through this. This comes from the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care, which is a group that influences medical care, it influences counseling, it influences education, so it's all over the place, not just universities. But these are their 6 principles, and the first one is safety, and I think it's first because the rest of them build the safety. Trustworthiness and transparency is something that Jared's already provided an example of. Part of trustworthiness and transparency is having very clear policies. Right? You have a very clear syllabus. That's something that we can do. Peer support, things that we do in class to almost demand peer support are things that we can do. Collaboration and mutuality cuts across peers and the person in charge in the classroom, the teacher. Empowerment, voice, and choice are things we can do. And the last one is cultural, historical, and gender issues. Okay. So there's a question for each, and what I'd like us to do as we think about these things and brainstorm for each of the questions is you have this orientation towards trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed teaching, that we aren't trying to do trauma-informed teaching, which is the be nice, so that we can be mean, right? We don't want to just like add a few things on to the side over here to support our students while we continue what may be harmful or disempowering teaching practices. Okay, so it's not to help students cope with abuse, to empower them to self-advocate, do justice. There's a phrase within all this that's like, rather than trauma-informed, we want to be trauma-transforming. Okay. Again, the fact of the matter is that sometimes with our teaching, we are doing harm. There's a couple of professors at ETSU, it turns out. Now I'm gonna I found that out last night. It's like, now I gotta go talk to them. They're right down the road. But they have this series of questions for each of these that I'd like to hear some examples of things you're doing in your class already, and maybe share some more ideas from the things I've been reading. So to what extent, in our case mainly, does the physical setting help students feel safe, accepted, respected, including feeling safe to learn from mistakes? So brainstorm at your table for a minute, and then I'll have us share out. Virtual setting, thinking of the idea of safety, would be having ground rules set. Like at the beginning of a course, you would say, hey, here are ground rules, just as an attempt to use our authority in a way that I think it's designed to do, which we use our authority ideally to keep students feeling safe. Okay, and the next question here is, to what extent do course policies in practice maximize trustworthiness and transparency by making expectations clear, ensuring consistency in practice, and maintaining appropriate boundaries, and minimizing disappointment? When I get to that last part, I get stuck. Don't get stuck on that last one. So just think of maybe some of the examples we've heard, as I said, was having a very clear syllabus is helpful with this. That can answer that last, like minimizing disappointment. Josh? It's always nice, I know as a student, it's really nice to have expectations made clear. One of the things we often do also is we use a rubric, right, for our grading. That rubrics help make the expectation clear to students, okay? All right, rubrics, yeah. So rubrics is something that helps with trustworthiness and transparency. Yeah, letting our expectations be made clear is a super helpful thing in establishing trustworthiness, transparency. One of the other things that you might think of here is that there may be times, so a lot of the stuff that we're talking about so far is in preparation, but sometimes in the moment, right, what happens if trust is broken? Well, you work to build that trust back. Probably through some collaboration and mutuality. As these things go together in my mind. So while these 6 things, I'm just like trying to break them apart. It's kind of hard for me. But so peer support is something that I work to build from day one in the teacher education classes through these introductions that I mentioned in the QEP Lunch and Learn, that we have students actually asking each other questions about each other, so that they can get to know each other, so that they can practice social skills, which is funny. That's one of the things that we're getting in education right now, is explicitly practice social skills. And you guys might think, oh, well, okay, that's surprising that you're doing that, but it's also, oh, well, good, because they need it, right? So what are some other peer support things that you all do that you would share? And one of the things I've found useful about the trauma-informed approach is, like, even if you have already established the mantra that behavior is communication, you still get annoyed, like, well, this is an annoying communication. All right. Sure, behavior is communication, and this one annoys the heck out of me. Okay. But as you kind of learn about trauma and its widespread, the fact that it's widespread, it can kind of give empathy so that you can step beyond kind of a judgmental or moralizing stance and start to be focused on solving the problem and getting to the task at hand and helping students get skills for peer support and practicing things that help them understand collaboration and mutuality in a world where they can just kind of Google things. And maybe a mantra as well to walk away from with this is, how can I start to learn what the invisible barriers are? Because there always are going to be some invisible barriers with the activities that we design, with the things that we expect from students. And so how can we anticipate them, ideally, but two, how can we improvise and support when we didn't see them, which is likely? So how can we jump in and support when those things pop up and we see those invisible barriers? I did an activity that kind of was about the peer support, and it was about collaboration, and it was one where they were designed to fail. That is, I intentionally set up this this scenario that was fictional. So it had we did like a, what are they called? Escape room. So we kind of did like an escape room activity where they had a series of puzzles that they had to solve. Now, thankfully, I teach a class where the objectives of the class are collaboration, leadership, and that kind of thing. So the content almost didn't matter, luckily, because we could focus on those other learning goals. But the point was that they were forced to work together, and they were forced to go talk to other people within the department in order to get like clues and answers to the questions. And unfortunately, one of the problems that I had set up was impossible, as no one could solve this one particular problem. And unfortunately, I just had to give them the answer, right? But in other situations, these barriers are things that we can do something other than just give the answer and actually support them and push them to achieve more than they would have otherwise. One of the things with collaboration that comes out here is a theme that I often hear in trauma-informed teaching. One of the anthems, I suppose, is rather than saying what's wrong with the student, we can ask what happened to the student. So one of the kind of, the suggestions within collaboration and mutuality is that when you have an accountability situation with the student, you approach it not from a like, hey, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you that you couldn't do this? That we say, okay, we have an attitude of what happened to you. Again, as counselor, we don't have to be the counselor. We don't have to ask what happened to you, but we have to have the attitude that, okay, this isn't necessarily something that is inherent to the student, that they can control, that is causing this problem. The fifth element of this approach is empowerment, voice, and choice. As educators, we've been talking about choice as one of the main ways to increase student motivation for about, 50 or 60 years. And so that one may be familiar. But one of the things when we talk about empowerment that I've kind of tried to step a little further is the student generation of content. And as real simple examples, I'm doing it here with you all, right? You all are generating some of the content for this presentation with your examples, okay? What are some other ways that you all answer this question in your class? It's so, like, they have to choose their dissertation. If we gave them their dissertation topic, what would our percentage of completers be? Like if we told them, here's your topic, you do this, right? It has to be something that students are passionate about. And that may not sound relevant to maybe your topic or what you teach, but you can take a lesson from that. In what ways can choice be included? When we give them choice, though, we do kind of have to have that in mind, because sometimes the student choice can lead to a lack of safety. I had kind of an unfortunate incident last year where it's like, hey, we're doing a role play. And one of the students chose to role play something violent, right? And we had to do like a restorative circle afterwards to kind of deal with the fallout of that student choice, right? This was something I wouldn't have chosen, and by laying out ground rules ahead of time, I probably could have avoided it, right? So these are things I've made mistakes about. Like, so now when we do the role play, I of course have to say something along the lines of, hey, these are sensitive times, so we're not going to role play anything that includes violence of any kind, right? Okay, so I want to get to some tips. I'll just have one of the questions here that goes along with this is, to what extent do you integrate course content that has been created by and represents people of diverse identities and perspectives? This is one that gets at trauma-informed teaching in a way that relates to our QEP as well, that idea of intellectual empathy, where we're intentionally involving and making explicit diverse ideas and perspectives. So one of the things that's one of the biggest, the reason I wanted to skip to this because it's 12:50, one of the biggest findings among all the research, now most of the trauma-informed teaching research does come from the K-12 area, but this I think extends up. That is to say, it's this idea of self-awareness and self-care, and the fact that if you are not kind of regulated yourself, if you don't know your own triggers, if you don't know yourself well, if you haven't done some of this nervous system work, as some of the folks are calling it, then it's really hard to help a student that is in stress and is in crisis or distress, okay? This helps be calm. It helps us be understanding. And if a student is dysregulated, they need self-regulated grown-ups. They need us to be the grown-up in the room. They don't need an escalation. If they start yelling at us, this is a time to step out of the classroom. It's not a time to start yelling back. It's not a time to show that you are the authority in the class or anything like that. Because this is probably a student that you are not the reason that they've started yelling, right? So, and this comes back again to this idea of the teaching. If we're going to have the rigor, then we have to have the support. That is to say, if we set up a situation where we have peer support, where we have collaboration, where we have trustworthiness, that allows us to push even harder academically. That is, we want them to be uncomfortable academically, right? Like, that's why we're here. We want to push them into like new realms, into new worlds. We want the safety to come from peer support. We want the safety to come from the structure of our course. We want the safety to come from things that are well within our control, so that then they can deal with the discomfort and the trouble and the struggle of new perspectives, thinking in ways they haven't thought before, hearing different perspectives, expanding their horizons in an academic way. She's only come across one university that actually is university-wide, institutionally working in a trauma-informed way. So that makes all the rest of us, so that's one in the world that she's seen. That makes all the rest of us working within these confines that we have to work within. That we have these institutional limits that we can't necessarily change, depending on what we do as a faculty. But again, on the with the positive view of things, we have a counseling services center. We have these other things that are part of our system that we need to work with. We have each other to talk to for ideas and advice when we do get stumped with a time limit. But some institutions are trying to work towards a more integrated, all the way around, wraparound services. We have the Credo thing. We're trying to do the retention thing. This works with retention. There are steps that we're taking, but as we all know here, like most other institutions, we're far from perfect. When you see students who need flexibility, if you say, okay, I'm going to extend the deadline here, well, the great things about deadlines is that the thing is turned in and you're done, right? And so then all of a sudden you're compounding their work by saying, hey, I'm going to give you 2 more weeks on this, and you're going to have 2 more. Oh, but we're still doing the other stuff, right? And so, it's a tricky dance, and I don't have a good answer necessarily for that. There's a few things that I do, some kind of mindsets that I take now, that I've been inspired by this. And one of them is, no matter when a student comes into my class, if they're on time or if they're tardy or whatever, but especially when they're tardy, instead of a glare, instead of a scowl, I go over and quietly say, I'm glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. And coming out of kind of what is my kind of Christian version of trauma-informed education, one of them is those students beating themselves up or whatever, is kind of this idea that you couldn't be more perfect. God made you. You are exactly what God had in mind when he made you. So these kinds of like mantras that I've gotten from this guy named Gregory Boyle, who does gang ministry, these mantras have really helped me as a teacher kind of get over myself, so to speak, and teach students humans rather than the subject.